So chickens are pretty social animals, like us. We're also social animals. And because they're social animals, a lot of um, their intelligent behavior shows up when in a social context. So, for example, chicken communication, which is fairly complex, not necessarily the way that they communicate, but the decisions that they make in communicating. Um, so there's two kinds of um, sort of ways that they can signal. There's vocalizations and there's visual displays. So they can either say something, they can call out, or they can perform like an action. And um, what's cool about them is they use these two kinds of signals to communicate referentially, God, um, aka in reference to something. So, like a human can say a word like bear, and other humans around them know that they're referring to a bear that it might be in the area, and then they can react as if they had saw the bear themselves. And chickens use calls in very much the same way. Like if a chicken, spots a ground predator, then they'll give a certain call, like a specific alarm call, and other chickens around them will react, um, with an appropriate strategy to deal with a ground predator. They'll, also call out to like signal that everyone knows, and they'll like scan the horizon to find where the predator is, and then they'll flee into cover or just away or like fly onto a tree or whatever, which is like a good strategy because terrestrial predators are typically ambush predators. And so if they're detected, they're a lot less likely to continue the hunt. If a chicken spots an aerial predator, their behavior is a bit more complex because aerial predators rely on the speed of their attacks rather than stealth. And so calling out means that you're more likely, or that chicken is more likely to be attacked by the aerial predator, which obviously the chickens don't want. And because of this, the chickens will use what's called risk mitigation techniques. They'll, which sounds kind of, fancy, but essentially just means that they're going to consider the situation that they're in order to decide how they should behave. They'll consider whether they are undercover or whether there's other chickens nearby. Like, so here's sort of a review over whatever. Here's an overview of how they react. First of all, male chickens and female chickens act pretty differently when there is an aerial predator, and so I'll talk about one and then talk about the other. So male chickens, they only give an alarm call if there is a female chicken nearby, and they're more likely to signal, and they'll signal for longer per call if they're close to a safe location, or if they're hiding under plants, or if there's another male chicken that the predator might target over them. And then female chickens they only call if they have chicks. Otherwise, they'll crouch down and they'll like hide among the ground, and they'll only flee when the predator draws near, because if they stay still, then it's much less likely that they're spotted. And another thing that chicken communication focuses on, there's not a lot of, it's a pretty simple life as a chicken. So the other thing that they really talk about is food. And so when food is discovered, males will do this thing called tidbitting, where they make a series of rhythmic motions and they pick up and drop the food repeatedly, and they make like quick vocalizations and announce to the whole group that they found this food. These vocalizations are also individual, like distinctive. It's not just saying like there's food here, it's saying this chicken found the food. Because of that, finding food like enhances the male's reputation, which increases the chance that they get a mate, because hens prefer roosters who find food and like share to the whole group more often. They're more likely to choose them to mate. And the female chickens will keep track of all the male chickens of who's bringing that food more often, in order to show that behavior of preferring males that provide more food. Occasionally, males will do the tidbitting display, even though they didn't actually find any food. There isn't any actual food there. If they do this too often, then the females will stop, responding to that male's call. And so the female chickens are keeping track of all the male chickens individually, and keeping track of like a reputation standing of whether they're a good, reliable one or a unreliable chicken. And then also some complex behavior is might be a male that wants to covertly get the attention of a female and like avoid the attention of a more dominant male. And because the tidbitting has both the vocalizations and the visual display, you don't need both of them. And so if the dominant male is like paying attention, then the less dominant male will just do the visual portion. He'll just do the rhythmic motions and pick up and drop the food to covertly get the attention of the female. But if the other male is distracted, the male will do both the visual and vocal segments of the tidbitting display. Chickens are able to take the perspective of other creatures in order to get an advantage in a situation. Both other chickens, which makes sense because they're a chicken, they can, that's a bit, I think, easier to take the perspective of, but also other animals like hiding under cover. They know that they're not going to be seen by an aerial predator because they know that the aerial predator is looking down from above, which is a pretty basic task for, an adult human, but it is a pretty complex, from a cognitive standpoint. And that taking the perspective of others also makes chickens empathetic. Like there was this one experiment where these hens got a puff of air like blown at them, and they didn't really react or anything. They were like monitored for their reaction, and didn't give anything indicated that they were in any sort of distress or concern or anything. And then that same puff of air was given to their chicks, and the chicks got more distressed and showed those signs of increased heart rate and lowered eye temperature. And because the chicks started freaking out, then so did the hens. The hens also showed signs of stress, even though they knew that the puff of air was completely harmless, and the chicks weren't in any danger. They were reacting just to the emotional state of the chick. Basically, they were feeling empathetic for their chicks. Chickens are also able to do some like logical reasoning, which kind of shows up in pecking order. So, hens have like a hierarchical social structure, and say it's a situation where there's three hens. There's an observer hen, and then there's two hens that interact. One of them is a hen that is more dominant than the observer, And then there's another hen that the observer doesn't have, like it's a new hen for them. And they observe the interaction between those two. And if the new hen defeats the known dominant hen, then the observer hen will, when given the opportunity to interact with the new hen, will treat it as a more dominant chicken from the start, because it could infer that, power scaling rules, that chicken could beat this other chicken that could beat me, and so that chicken could beat me, which is called a transitive inference. Alternatively, you could see it as like, if A is more than B and B is more than C, then you know that A is more than C. That's sort of a more formal definition. But the hens are capable of making these transitive inferences. If in a different situation or a different scenario, the hen observes and sees that the known dominant hen defeats the unknown hen, then about roughly half the time they'll like challenge that unknown hen, because they know that that new hen is one that they could potentially beat. This sort of understanding of logic also extends to like numbers and quantities. So for example, the base level is seeing two quantities and choosing the one that's has more. Chickens are capable of that from a very young age, but also more advanced levels of, I think it was 5-day-old chicks were basically tasked with, there were two screens and there was some stuff behind them, and they had to observe from behind, like from the screens, things were added to and subtracted from the quantities that were behind the screens, and the chicks were able to keep track of how much was behind each screen, and would choose the screen that had the most behind it, because they were able to basically perform arithmetic. You probably haven't thought that chickens could do math, but they can do math. Yeah, so hopefully you learned a thing or two about chickens, and your perspective is a little different than it was before. Yeah, see you next time.